Our next speaker, Sandra Steingraber, has served as a science advisor for several state, federal, and international initiatives, including the California Breast Cancer Research Program, the National Action Plan on Breast Cancer, the President's Cancer Panel, and the Health and Environmental Alliance in the European Union. In 2011, Steingraber received a Heinz Award for Lifetime Achievement and donated the prize money to the anti-fracking movement in New York State. And it was no small thing, thus becoming a founder of New Yorkers Against Fracking. She is also a founding principal of Concerned Health Professionals of New York State, and it is our great delight to welcome Sandra Steingraber, Dr. Sandra Steingraber. Thank you very much.
My audio-visual aids come in a grocery bag. Well, good evening, everyone. All the Elmirans and Corningites and Madam Mayor. It's lovely to be here with you tonight. I'm speaking tonight out of my identity as a founder of Concerned Health Professionals of New York. And it's been our steadfast demand as physicians and scientists who work on public health that no decision about fracking New York can go forward until and unless we understand the effects on public health. Furthermore, we argue that the only correct instrument to gauge those health effects is a tool called a health impact assessment, which is a little bit like using crash test dummies in a new car to test for safety. In other words, you don't have to take a new car and fill it with real people and crash it and then measure their actual injuries. There's a way of simulating this, right? And so what a health impact assessment allows us to do is to forecast what the health effects would be of a polluting industry before you actually unroll it across the state. So rather than monitor and measure our cancer rates, our birth defect rates, our preterm pregnancies, asthma, heart attack rates after fracking occurs, we can simulate this and run the numbers ahead of time. So that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. And as you might know, the decision on whether or not to frack New York, to use the title of our evening together, now hinges upon those health effects as the decision-making at the level of Albany has boiled down to asking for more investigation on the part of the Department of Environmental Conservation, would be the kind of governing body for fracking, has now turned to our Department of Health to ask for more information on the health effects of fracking. It stops short of deploying a full health impact assessment, which is what we think should happen. But a study is underway of a review of the health effects. So I want to try to illuminate a little bit about what it is we're so concerned about. I'm going to leave out the intricacies of the health review and how it's similar or different from a health impact assessment, but I'm certainly, that would be a great question if you're interested to talk about in our Q&A together. Now, my talk tonight somehow ended up with 2 introductions, and that violates a basic rule of public speaking, and I apologize in advance for that. I don't know how that happened, but I'm going to take you through each of these 2 introductions, and I hope you'll kind of bear with me here. The first one takes you down into the shale itself. So I want to turn back the clock to 400 million years ago. Here in New York, if we were sitting here 400 million years ago, we would be bobbing around on the surface of an ocean. So this whole area, it was covered by a shallow sea. And this was so long ago that the creatures who lived in this ocean didn't look anything like ocean creatures do today. This was before lungs, it was before even gills, before three-chambered hearts or backbones, eyeballs, anything like that. So we're talking about plankton, but also sea lilies and squid that were swimming around in these waters. And because the Earth had less oxygen in it than it does now, because the land plants and other things hadn't kind of gotten started, right? And it's plants that make oxygen for us. The bottom of the ocean had less oxygen as well. So when these creatures died and sank to the bottom, instead of decomposing, which is what happens to us now, we turn into essentially carbon dioxide, they turned into bubbles of methane instead, which is what happens if you rot in an oxygen-poor environment. So when we say fossil fuels, we tend to think of things like lumps of coal, right? Because when you say fossil, you tend to conjure up in your mind's eye something kind of hard and crunchy. But in fact, these bubbles of methane, which is what the gas industry is after, represent the corpses of animals that lived 400 million years ago. But rather than being crunchy like a lump of coal or gooey like oil, instead they are a vapor, a gas. And their bodies turned into these bubbles of vapor that then were trapped inside the silty bottom of the ocean. Now, to the east, on the east bank of this ocean, was a large range of mountains approximating where the Catskill Mountains are now. The Catskills are actually a very old mountain range, but before them, there was another set of mountains. Of course, they had no name because there's nothing around to name them at the time, but geologists now call it the Acadia Range. And that set of mountains entirely eroded into this inland sea. And mountains, as you might know, contain inside them an entire periodic chart of elements. So all those heavy metals, I'll name a few: lead, mercury, strontium, uranium, arsenic. Those all hold rightful places in the periodic chart of elements, and they tend to be found underground or inside of mountains. So when these mountains eroded, all of the elements they contained were bound up with the silt. Well, it's dust when it's in air, right? But as soon as it goes into water, now we call it silt. And so those elements were carried also into the bottom of this oxygenless ocean and became trapped in the silt along with those bubbles of methane. So over time, and with lots of pressure, that silt then petrified into what we call shale, the Marcellus Shale, about 200 feet or so thick. And so if you can imagine then inside of that layer of shale is a kind of petrified fizz of champagne bubbles. That's the methane. And they're very tiny bubbles that are trapped in there, along with all of these heavy metals, including some radioactive stuff like uranium and its various breakdown products, radium and radon. And so there they are, and all bound up together, and they've been that way for a very, very long time. So that's the landscape that we're talking about, and it's an invisible landscape that no one has seen. And so why should we care about its integrity? Why not blow it up and get those bubbles of methane out? Well, it turns out that there are some serious health consequences for us, and that's what I want to describe to you as soon as I get done with the second introduction. All right, so here's my second introduction. It's an introduction to the field of basic toxicology. So in my field of environmental health, we worry about routes of exposure. We think about the ways in which our bodies are actually in communion with the environment that surrounds it. And we tend to think of our bodies as these kind of tough, leathery things. We move through an environment, and the environment's out there, and all these genes and hormones and things that are inside of us go on entirely separately from the world that we inhabit. But in fact, there's all kinds of places where the environmental world is streaming in and out of ourselves on a regular basis. And the most obvious one is every time we take a breath. So when you breathe in, you're taking in about a pint of atmosphere with every breath that you inhale. And it turns out that your lungs are your biggest organ. We talk about our skin as the biggest organ. It's actually not true. And so I did the math on this. If you take apart your lungs and spread out the surface area of your lungs, they fill the approximate space as a tennis court. That's something you might want to just drop into cocktail conversation if you run out of something interesting to say. Whereas your skin, if you spread it all out, is about the size of the bedspread on your bed, right? So tennis court bedspread, it's bigger. And that layer of, so the business end of your lungs, upon where the oxygen exchange takes place, is only 1/9, it's as thick as 1/9 of a human hair. It's a micron thick. So imagine a human hair and imagine try to a 1/9 of that thickness. That is the boundary between your inside of your body and the atmosphere in which you live. It's that thin. So every time you take a breath, then this very, very fine layer is the only thing that separates the inside of you from the atmosphere in which you live. All right. And then there's water. All of us by weight are 65% water, right? So it's our blood plasma. It's the cerebral spinal fluid around our brain. It's the exhaled breath on a cold winter day. And so when we drink water, it becomes us. It becomes 65% of us, 2/3 of us is the water that we drink. And where does that water come from? Well, it depends on where you're from. Here in this area, most of your drinking water comes from groundwater. It comes from the aquifer, the water under your feet that we walk over and drive over every single day. And how did that water get there? Well, groundwater is recharged by rain, right, which falls down from the clouds, and then like a falling curtain, those raindrops penetrate through the soil and then enter the groundwater aquifers. And then from there, groundwater can kind of float around in those underground vaults for a lot of years, sometimes thousands of years. But eventually, aquifers are the mother of rivers, and they will come back up to the surface and form the headwaters of some river. The Chemung River, the Susquehanna River, all these have heads, and usually it's a spring of some kind that comes up from underground. So groundwater is the mother of rivers, and then from rivers, a lot of people also drink. And in the United States, about 60% of people drink from rivers as their primary source, or reservoirs, which are backed up rivers, and about 40% of us drink from groundwater. And you might think that's a little bit odd. Why not most people drinking from groundwater? And that's because most metropolitan cities rely on surface water sources, and more people live in cities. And so New York City, of course, draws its drinking water famously from reservoirs, surface water sources in the Catskills. So you've got 8 million people or so drinking from that water. And then the Susquehanna River services a vast number of millions of people downstream, going all the way from Philadelphia all the way down to, of course, the Chesapeake Bay area. The Susquehanna makes up 45% actually of the water flow in the Chesapeake Bay area that people all the way down to Baltimore rely on. So it's really us rural folk that rely disproportionately on our groundwater resources, less big cities. So that's the wheel of the water cycle as it's been forever turning, right? So sometimes the water is held in clouds and then it comes down as rain. It recharges our aquifers. The aquifers then become rivers, and some people drink from that, and it goes around and around like that. And then it becomes our blood plasma. It becomes 65% of us. Then there's food, which we eat every day for energy and also to make stuff like mussels, which require protein, and we can't get any other way. And so eating food is also an ecological act. And so, well, I've enacted breathing, so let me do the other things here. So this is water from my drinking water well, which is a municipal well. I live in Trumansburg on Cayuga Lake. So this comes from a groundwater aquifer that's recharged by rain that's right next to Cayuga Lake. So when I drink this, by the end of the talk, that will now become, that these raindrops in here will become my blood plasma and will be pumping through my heart. In fact, probably by the time I get through introduction number 2, that will be true. And then this is a good old Empire apple grown right here in New York State's a good store, so probably picked in the fall and then stayed through the winter. I bite into it. And that also, by the time I'm done, will have become the fibers of who I am. So breathing water and food are 3 routes of exposure to toxic chemicals. So those are 3 ways that if our air, our water, or our food are adulterated with toxic chemicals, those chemicals can find their way inside of us. There's one more route of exposure, and that's through skin, called dermal exposure. So our skin is a pretty good raincoat. You go outside and you don't swell up and get soggy by standing in the rain, because our skin is really good at repelling water. But it has an oily surface on it, right? Which is why when you put oily hand lotion on, it will soak in. It actually gets inside you. And so if there's any chemical that is fat soluble, it has an easy way of soaking through your skin. So that's another route of exposure. And it turns out that if your water is contaminated in your house and you're drinking contaminated water, your main route of exposure is not through drinking. It's through bathing and showering, both because of dermal absorption and because of inhalation. So here's another little interesting fact you can whip out at an awkward dinner party. A 10-minute shower is the exposure equivalent to a half a gallon of tap water. So you can drink a half a gallon of tap water. And if there's a chemical in your water, I'm not saying this very well, drinking half a gallon of tap water is the same exposure as taking a 10-minute shower, because those chemicals can go through your skin, and also because they turn into vapor, and then you inhale them across that big tennis court of your lungs. Okay, so those are my two introductions. So here's my main point, I guess. So now I'll give away my thesis right up front. We don't know, and we in the environmental health community have not yet identified all the routes of exposure to chemicals in the whole process of drilling and fracking and everything that goes along with it. We're just discovering what some of those are. Therefore, no set of regulations can be said to be adequate, because how do you know what you're regulating? Regulations work when you first identify what all the dangers are, and then you can demonstrate that you can mitigate each of those dangers through regulations and enforcement to the point where the risks to human health are negligible, or that we all agree they're somehow acceptable. So you can put, seat belts and airbags in a car and bring down injury rates to the point where we all have kind of agreed that we'll put up with the dangers. But we don't know what all the dangers are of fracking yet. We haven't done the basic science to learn them, and so it's premature to say that any regulations are sufficient, which is why we in the public health community are asking for that science to be done as a precondition for making any decision about fracking in New York. Just because the industry rolled out this technology across many states before that research is done doesn't make it safe. So besides this sort of big pool of ignorance that we in the scientific community are facing, there are nevertheless many reasons to suspect that these dangers are not trivial. We have emerging signals for harm, and none of these data points that I'm about to describe to you are considered definitive, but they are, I would argue, like individual jigsaw puzzle pieces. If you look at any one in isolation, it doesn't tell you very much. But if you begin to assemble the pieces of the puzzle together, a picture starts to emerge as different studies start to show you similar things. And those are the little pieces now I want to describe to you in a few minutes. I'll start with sand mining. So the process of fracking really doesn't start when you drill a hole in the ground here over the Marcellus Shale. It begins in the Midwest with the mining for sand. And that's because the sand itself is actually the agent for fracking. The water is the fire hose that's used to shoot the sand grains into the shale. The sand grains are necessary because without them, even though the water, we have engines powerful enough to shoot water with enough pressure up to 10,000 pounds per square inch to blow apart rock. But the lithostatic pressure of the Earth, right? Remember, there's a mile of Earth sitting on top of it. It's just going to close those cracks back up as soon as you release the pressure. So how are you going to prop those cracks open to let the bubbles flow out? And the answer is you use silica sand, which is the Samson of sand grains. So silica has a physical structure that's able to withstand lithostatic pressure. It won't crumble even when you munch it with huge amounts of pressure. And so the part of the job of the water in hydraulic fracking is to blast the sand into the cracks, the fractures that you create, and then they hold the stony doors ajar so the bubbles can keep flowing out. And of course, once you've blasted sand grains into cracks, they're open forevermore. So whatever's in there is going to keep flowing out. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because that's why I wanted to describe to you, remember all those elements, including things like radon, that are also in there. When you fracture the lid on Pandora's box and then you prop it open, things keep flowing out of there that are not just methane, but other stuff too. And once they start flowing, there's no way to close the lid, right? Because you can't get the sand grains back out of the cracks again. So it's a technology that's irreversible. And even with Deep Sea Horizon, remember all those agonizing months where we were watching as they tried to pour all kinds of weird things down the hole and plug it up? They finally did get it plugged. But fracturing shale is not, it's like shattering a teapot. You're not ever going to be able to put the pieces back together again. It's done once it's done, and it's a completely irreversible process. So why do we care about silica? These are two things I'll pass around. First of all, the mining for silica sand is a terribly destructive operation. So this silica sand was gathered near my home. I grew up in rural Illinois along the Illinois River Valley. And that's now in the crosshairs of the silica industry as it leases land for people to mine for silica. Except those folks are never getting their land back. When you lease for silica mining, you basically move out, because what they'll do is dig a 10-story deep hole in the ground, and then wherever there's sandstone, and then blast it apart to form this silica sand, and then load this into rail cars. So what you end up with is like the moonscape. So I have stood on the side of this particular silica mine, and it was like looking down into the moon. There wasn't a living thing, for 10 acres, and then 10 stories down, and you see these, it's like looking down at a kid's sandbox with these tiny little bulldozers down in the bottom moving around. So this is the sand that was mined near my home, and this is what it looks like. This was collected near the railroad tracks here where you are after it's cleaned and processed. So I'll pass both around. So why do we care about silica sand? Well, silica is a lot like asbestos. When you inhale it as dust, it can lodge deep within your lungs and trigger an autoimmune reaction that leads to a couple diseases. One is lung cancer. It's a known cause of lung cancer. And another is silicosis, which is like rheumatoid arthritis, which incidentally silica dust is also associated with, is an autoimmune disease that's progressive, and even after exposure ends. So that's really important, because you can have a young, healthy worker who's exposed to just a few months of silica dust on the job on a drill pad, and then even after he quits his job, once silicosis starts, it turns those that business end of your lung that's so fine that gas exchange can happen into fibrous bumps, and you can't then breathe, right? You can't get oxygen across that anymore. And so it's like turning your lungs into gristle, and that will progress even after the exposure ends. So it's a very disabling disease. We've never exposed the general population to large amounts of silica dust. We know what happens when a sandblaster is exposed, but we don't know what happens if a pregnant woman is exposed, or a 4-year-old child, or an older person who might already have emphysema, or suffer from high blood pressure, or some kind of respiratory disorder as a precondition. Other health problems come from well pad construction itself. Vast amounts of land have to be cleared to not only build the well pad, which takes 4 to 9 acres, but also the pipelines, the compressor stations, the condensers, the processors, all the things that Dr. Ingrafia showed you and talked to you about take vast amount of acreage, and that then is cleared, leading almost inevitably to sedimentation of surface water. So why would you care about that unless you're a fly fisherman? Well, it turns out if you drink from surface water, then and there's a lot of sediment in it, when you chlorinate that, the chlorine will combine with the carbon in the sediment to create disinfection byproducts like chloroform, and these things are actually carcinogenic. They're linked to bladder and they're linked to colon cancer. So those of us who drink groundwater don't have to worry about that, but we do need to think about what we're doing to the rivers like the Susquehanna and its tributaries like the Chemung, upon which millions of people who live downstream from us depend. So if we sediment the rivers at their source, then people downstream from us will suffer from increased risks of cancer when they chlorinate that water. The other risk for us is noise pollution. This construction, which, as Tony points out, goes on for months at a time, and then when they're done with one well, they start on another sequentially. It takes 1 to 2 months to drill down a mile and then drill like a robotic mole going sideways for another mile. And that's a 24/7 operation that goes on without stopping, and the decibel level is very high. Just to give you a sense, a decibel level of a helicopter or a jackhammer is about 105, whereas the sound of drilling a hydrofracked well comes in at 115. That does, of course, attenuate the further away you are. Is it below 35, which is what's considered safe for us as background noise, at 500 feet, which is the setback that we were offered? No, it does not. And of course, added to that are not just the drills, but also the trucks, and there's a lot of light pollution and so forth. All of this light pollution and noise pollution is linked to high blood pressure. And even interestingly enough, even if it doesn't wake you up at night, which it almost certainly would, but even if you sleep with noise of decibel over 35, your blood pressure remains elevated. And high nighttime blood pressure are linked to things like heart attack and stroke risk. Also linked, interestingly enough, to learning disabilities in children. And so if you have drilling operations near a school where you have decibel levels higher than 45, ambient level of 45, you see children's test scores go down, their ability to remember things and pay attention goes down with noise level. We have very good data on that. So I want to now talk about those well casings a bit that you heard described so eloquently by Dr. Ingrafia. When they leak, you saw the bubbles of methane coming to the surface. We don't yet know what effect methane has on our health. And you might hear the stories that methane is not toxic. Not exactly true. We've never done the studies to determine if they're toxic, which is different than saying we've done the studies, right, and found that there's no proof of harm. So the fact that we have no proof that methane is harmful to ingest is a statement that is a statement of ignorance. It's not a statement of negative data. In addition, remember all those creatures that used to live down there 400 million years ago that turned into bubbles of methane? Well, they also turned into other things. They turned into bubbles of other hydrocarbons. So it's not just bubbles of methane that they became. They also became bubbles of benzene. They also became bubbles of propane and butane and toluene and ethylbenzene and formaldehyde. All those bubbles are also trapped in the shale. And when you shatter that to get the methane out, those other hydrocarbons, which are also vapors, come up. And they start coming up as soon as the drill goes down and intersects with the shale. And so, in other words, before the whole thing is hooked up to a pipeline, right? And so, meanwhile, you just have venting all these vapors, some of which is methane, but some of which are these other things. I worry especially about benzene, because benzene is a known cause of leukemia and a known cause of birth defects in children at very low levels. We have emerging data now from Colorado showing that people who live in houses 3/4 of a mile away from a drilling and fracking operation have in their ambient air levels of benzene that we know are associated with increased risk for cancer, increased risk for birth defects, and also neurological developmental problems in children. In other words, we know from other studies that children who breathe that level of benzene in their ambient air will have neurodevelopmental problems. It's like being lead poisoned, essentially. So those are just a few examples of health effects. I have many more I could describe for you, but I want to leave time to see what your interests are. So I'm going to stop here and then show you some of the other things in my bag here. This is tomorrow's lunch for my kids. It includes almond butter because my son has an allergy to peanut butter. This is once again almond butter, a local company. And the water in this almond butter is New York water. So should you contaminate the water, you would contaminate this jar of almond butter. This flour is going to end up in my bread maker tonight, and it's farmer ground flour. The wheat is grown by farmers in my county, which is Tompkins County, and they have a cooperative, and they turn this grain into flour in a mill right in my village of Trumansburg. That's why I buy it, because I'm supporting the millers as well as the farmers. And there's actually a baker, Wide Awake Bakery, that turns this into loaves of bread too. And sometimes I buy those when I'm feeling flush. But they sell, those are delicious loaves of bread, and far better than I can make. But they sell for $9 a loaf down in Brooklyn. I think they're $6 here. So I rely on my own bread machine. The farmers tell me they would like to expand their operations because the demand for their bread and for the flour far exceeds what they can provide. In fact, when you join their bread CSA, you actually stand in a bread line on every Wednesday night, and you have to sign out your loaf of bread, right? So precious are they, these loaves of bread. And they could sell probably twice as many, but all the land is leased to the oil and gas industry, and so they're not able to expand. So here you have an example, I think, of something that you just heard from Dr. Barth, the way the greediness of the land use alone can interfere with economic development. Here are two things my kids can't get enough of: Chobani yogurt, and this will be gone by tomorrow morning, I guarantee it, once it goes into my refrigerator tonight. And this Gouda cheese from Schuyler County. My son especially has a Jones for this. So we are the #3 dairy state in the nation. We are also the #3 producer of organic vegetables, and we are also the #2 wine state in the nation. And these are a huge part of our economy. The thing about dairy is it's very sensitive to radiation exposure. Cow's milk, more than any other media I know, absorbs any radiation in the environment. That's why when Fukushima happened, just a few weeks later, cow's milk in Vermont began to show elevated levels of radioactive cesium. So when you have, remember all that radioactive heavy metal down there, and things like radium and radon, that comes up with the wastewater, which is in two forms. One is called flowback, and one is called produced water. They're the same stuff. The problem is that there's no good storage solution for the permanent containment of this toxic, briny, radioactive wastewater. We can truck it to Ohio and shove it back into deep well injection sites, which are linked to earthquakes there. So one way to try to deal with the volume of it is to allow what's called a beneficial use determination, to allow the produced water to be used to de-ice our roads. Given the fact that it's low-level radioactive, it not only de-ices well from the brine, but it will also, of course, with rain and snow, run into our pastures and into our water and so forth. A lot of folks are worried about what it might mean for drinking water. I am too. But actually, from a toxicological perspective, these are my main worries because cow's milk is so sensitive to radiation exposure. I'm worried not only that it will create health effects, but because milk is so associated with purity and wholesomeness, that all it would take is one container of radioactive yogurt, and I think our dairy industry would be done. I think that we would have a hard time marketing that to the rest of the world as something that we want to export from New York. So we know that we're building up our yogurt industry, and that's a good thing. Can we have fracking and yogurt both? Can we unroll a highly polluting radioactive practice over top of the pastures where the animals that make this live? My argument is that we can't. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thanks.